What is the difference between cybersecurity governance and frameworks? To explain this, let's go back in history to the Roman Empire. And the Romans had a senate house known as the Curia Julia. And even today, if you visit modern Rome, you can find some of the ancient remains of this building still there intact. Now, you could think of the Curia Julia as the modern day Parliament if you are watching from the UK, or perhaps the Congress if you are watching from the USA. Or if you were born in ancient Rome, you would know this as the SPQR, which stood for the Senate and People of Rome. So, why is this history lesson important? Well, this is where it gets really cool. FYI, there is a typo, apologies, in the bullet text. It should say SPQR, QR as in QR code. Now, the reason why SPQR was an interesting initial was that it stood for the government and the authority of the ancient Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire. But more importantly, these initials appeared on official Roman documents, monuments, legionary standards, and even Romans' public manhole covers on the streets. You could say that this SPQR was the central governance framework back in the days of the Roman Empire. And whilst the Roman Empire is no more, you could argue that the same concept still applies today in the modern day empire, which you could argue is the USA economy, aka from the Roman Republic all the way to the USA capitalism economy. And to further keep this analogy in line, let's compare the two soldiers from the two empires, arguably, as the concept around governance and frameworks is largely the same. So let's say we have the USA Army soldier and we have the equivalent Roman SPQR soldier. And both these two soldiers from different historical times would take their commands, aka governance, from a central framework or a central position of power. For example, the modern day USA Army soldier would take his commands from his government base or commander in line of charge, aka indirectly the USA government. And in a similar fashion, the Roman SPQR soldier would take his commands or line of charge from the Curia Julia, aka the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire. So, in other words, both these soldiers would have a chain of command. And this chain of command is part of an overall governance structure, which consists of various frameworks, which we'll go into in just a moment. As now we have set the historical context around governance, let's link this into how this works in modern day cybersecurity. Because the ultimate concept of governance is still the same whether you are studying for the CISSP or CCSP exam. And hopefully by remembering this historical video on the two time periods around governance will help you remember these important concepts. So, governance sets the direction, strategy, and accountability for an organization's risk, or in this case, cybersecurity risk. And cybersecurity governance comes from senior leadership, e.g., the C levels, the CEO, CFO, CIO, CTO, CSO, etc., etc. And this is known as a top down approach coming from the top, e.g., the commander sets the direction, strategy, and accountability. And in order to implement that governance, this is done through a framework. A framework is a structured approach, e.g. policies, processes, controls used to implement governance. As you can see indicated by the pictures on your screen, where governance is moving from a high-level direction, whereas a framework is moving to a more operational execution of such governance. And a framework consists of a myriad of documentation, which we will discuss in just a moment. But just for now, remember that a framework is a structured approach to implement governance, and that's a key differentiation between governance and framework, although governance leads ideally to a framework. And a technical keynote, a security framework starts with a security policy. And another keynote around governance is you can think of this as a collection of practices used within an organization that can be compared against external industry practices. Now let's dive into some of the documentation within a framework, starting with a policy. And as mentioned, in a cybersecurity framework, this usually starts with what is known as a security policy. And this is a high-level document that sets the expectations of the organization and its approach to cybersecurity. You can think of the policy as the why document that is approved at C level, the highest level, of why security is needed and the effort that is required to provide such security across the business. And from the policy is another document derived which is known as standards, which define quantifiable requirements of the what. And the level of detail in the standards is much more than a high-level policy. And to remember this, you can think that a standard should provide enough detail that an audit can be performed to determine whether the standard is being met, aka the requirements within that standard. And once the policy, the why, and the standards, the what, have been set, Then the rest of the documentation underneath those two levels are more granular technical details, such as baselines, which set a minimum level of security that every system in the business must meet. Baselines are pretty rigid and are not flexible by any means. That is where other documentation beneath a baseline can go into. But the next document underneath a baseline is usually a standard operating procedure or a procedure. And this is essentially a how-to document, a detailed step-by-step document that describes exact actions necessary to implement a specific security control mechanism or solution. Technical keynote: a procedure document will reference the original baseline standards and policies as part of the overall framework, but the procedure document is designed to go into step-by-step detail and can be used by technical people to implement technical solutions. Whereas you may hear of guidelines, which are flexible how-to documents and are not as strict as the other documents mentioned here. And guidelines are more of a nice to have rather than a formal need to have. In other words, you can think of guidelines as aspirational best practice. Now, just to recap what we've just learned, you can think of the security policy as the why, the standards as the what, and the procedure SOP as the how. And indirectly, all these documents form a soldier's chain of command, which forms a part of a framework, which is part of a bigger governance process. And here's a final exam tip. Whilst these terminologies are important, I wouldn't get too hung up on the terminologies. Just more understand the concepts and the myriad of processes and documents that form the framework and the overall governance process. I hope you found today's video informative and enjoyed the content. If so, please be sure to like and subscribe to please help support this channel's growth. This channel cannot grow and be pushed to more and more YouTube users in the YouTube algorithm without your support. Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed the content as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you would like to see more content like this, it would be super fantastic if you could leave a like and subscribe to help support this channel's growth.